Hello BookTube, it's Tony here from Lockster Reads. It's been a long time. I am going to try and get more consistent with these videos. I just wanted to do an update on what I've been reading recently, because I had a bad February reading month, I had a bad March reading month, but April so far has been pretty good. And whatever the causes of my quarter 1 book slump were, and I suppose by the standards of other people it wasn't much of a book slump, but by my standards it was. So I've got back on track a bit, and I've done so firstly abandoning any sort of actual structured plans I had for reading for the year. I've kind of gone along a book, I'm going to call it book tag approach, which is reading a book, and then if that book is good, or if that book has some interesting things in it, reading a book that's either by the same author, or by an author recommended in that book, or by on a subject that comes up in that book that I'm interested in. Now, you'll see what I mean when I start talking about what I've been reading. Now, as I said, I was at the start of April. I was in something of a book slump, and I didn't help myself by reading Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. This is obviously a Penguin classic. It's an abridged version of the full journal, and frankly, it was a bit of a slog. It could do with more illustrations and more notes for a person who doesn't really know the ins and outs of biology and geology. Plus, Darwin's views of the native peoples he sees, with the possible exception of the Tahitians, are, let's say at best, unreconstructed. I'm not sure it's racism in the modern sense of the word, because it seems to focus more on the respectability of peoples rather than their actual race, and it's more also about his faith in the reforming nature of the British Empire, of the Christian British Empire, and it does make for an uncomfortable reading experience, which, as I said, isn't helped by the abridgment choices. I think the editor, and I think he says this in the introduction, makes a specific choice to focus more on those kind of cultural entries than the more scientific stuff, which is understandable for a choice when you're publishing an abridged version of a book like this for the general reader. But I'm almost want to say it's not really for the general reader. I did pick out a few bits which I've got to take out, because this is, as you can see, is a library book. A lot of a chunk of the entries on the flora and fauna required me to go backwards and forwards to Google quite a lot for clarification. I was a bit more on certain ground with the geology, because I did geography OA and at degree level. It wasn't, my degree was history with geography, geography being the minor, so I didn't specialise in that. But I did sort of have more awareness of what the terms meant, and what which was helpful. And I did actually check a couple of bits of his ideas versus what current thinking is. There was a whole section in here on how he thinks atolls are created in the Pacific. His theory seems to be one of the two favoured ones. There is another one which seems to be more popular at the moment, but it's interesting that he was theorising on the causes. If I ever want to read this again, which I'm going to say at this point is unlikely, I'd like a big chunky edition with like copious notes, photographs, illustrations, or even like a web version of it where you can click on things, and it sort of like a Wikipedia version of the Voyage of the Beagle. I'm glad I read it. So my next steps from this is either to read The Origin of the Species, which might be a bit much for my little brain, or I have a copy of David Attenborough's Life on Earth book. Um, I used to have one when I was a kid, which obviously over the 40 years or whatever it is since I owned that book has disappeared. But I got a copy recently. It's up in the. Can you see it in here? I can't. Don't know if you can. It's up there somewhere. Um, so I'm tempted to reread that. So yeah, but I'm kind of glad. I'm kind of glad I read it. I can't say I recommend it though, particularly not this Penguin Classics version. Um, so at that point, I was kind of struggling still. But then I started reading with some friends. I haven't got a copy of it because I read it on uh, Kindle. Of Jane Austen's bookshelf, The Women Writers Who Shaped a Legend by Rebecca Romney. Now, Romney's by profession is a rare book dealer, which informs this book a lot in terms of its structure. I mean, this was probably going to appeal to me because I'm a great fan of books about reading and books. I've only ever read one Jane Austen book, which is Pride and Prejudice, which I liked. But Romney looks at basically in the book. Romney looks at authors who are mentioned in Austen's work. Each one gets a chapter which outlines their biography, their literary rise, and often their fall. Romney's discussion of collecting their books and the books about them. Actually, I should note that Romney's authors are all women. Male writers get mentioned, but the authors that she talks about are Austen herself, Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Lennox, Hannah More, Charlotte Smith, Elizabeth Inchbald, Hester Lynch Thrale Piozzi, and Maria Edgeworth. Now, I'd heard of Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Lennox, Charlotte Smith, and Maria Edgeworth, but I hadn't heard of the others. And Romney does a good job of making you want to read some of those authors as well, with the possible exception of Hannah More, whose sort of Christian moralising Romney sort of struggles with a bit. And she talks about Hannah More's a novel of Hannah More's and struggling with that, but you do kind of want to read the books, and I actually really want to read. I think top of the list is The Female Quixote, by Charlotte Smith. No, sorry, by Charlotte Lennox. And actually Charlotte Smith's poetry, which the book makes clear was actually quite influential on the Romantic poets, but is almost entirely forgotten. Um, and Romney's build some of the book around that process of forgetting, disappearing, how writers could be massively popular, well regarded, and then just fade from view. And when academics are creating canons, they never appear on those canons. There are contributory factors for what those changes are. Romney outlined some of them. There is a change, basically a change in fashion can cause writers to go out of popularity. Then there's like lack of critical or biographical sporting material, so that as you get distance between the original publication date and 50 years or 80 years or 100 years, and nobody's really writing biographies about these people or talking about these people critically. They just kind of just fade away. There can be there could be a critical attack on a writer later on, where somebody writes something about that writer, says that their books are typical of a blah blah blah, and that has an effect. This affects all of these things affect women writers more than men. In the 18th century, more novels were published by women than men, and part of the problem with the disappearance of these women is the fact that they were that novels were perceived to be what's the word, not respectable, and that women were discouraged from reading them because they were seen as bad examples to them, particularly things like Gothic novels, and that had a long-term impact on some of these writers, and on why they disappeared. It doesn't just happen to women writers; it happens to male writers as well. But it happens disproportionately to women writers. There is a truth universally acknowledged that things that young women like are genuinely perceived to be of less value than things that academic men like. Now I'm going to confess to something here. One of the reasons I've only ever read Jane Austen, one of the reasons I never read any of the Bronte sisters until I read Wuthering Heights, is that I did when for a long period of time I didn't really read classic novels unless I was forced to at school. Although the books I read for O level are still, like Great Expectations is still one of my favourite novels of all time. And then and there's a couple and what else did we do? Graham Greene, Brighton Rock we did, and that I really enjoyed that. So yeah, but I didn't read. I mostly read either non-fiction or science fiction and fantasy for a long time, for like through the 80s, 90s, and probably into the 2000s. And then because I was mixing with other people who read a lot of classics, I made an effort to start reading more of the classics. And part of the reason why I didn't read some of these books, and I admit this now, and and part of the reason, for example, hadn't read any romance books until the 2020s, was that those in my head were perceived to be books more aimed at women than at men, and I didn't think they were books for me. This turns out to be absolute arrant nonsense, and I'm so glad I've started reading classics. It's been, as I said, it's been encouraged by friends of mine who have given me recommendations, most of which have turned out to be great. I don't particularly like Wuthering Heights, but I haven't read it for a while, and it's due a reread. I love Charlotte Bronte's poetry. I think that was collected. It was collected in Penguin Classics. Thought that was great, better than Wuthering Heights. And I'd like to, and I've got a pile of books beside me to make up for my foolish misogyny. You can't call it anything else, really. The same applies to romance. I haven't read much. I still haven't read much romance, but I've read enough to realise that yes, it's full of tropes, but those tropes are the key thing is, are those tropes done well or are those tropes done badly? And what I've read so far, they were done well and the books were fun. And again, it just makes you realise that it's very easy to sort of get snobbish about genres, about writers, and yeah. So that book really made me think about how my own choices were made about books, and about reading. Now the next thing that happened was Nerdy Nurse Reads of this parish, or Alyssa, and I decided to read Barbara Pym's No Fond Return of Love. Again, this is the kind of book I would never ever have picked up 20 years ago. Again, I would have seen it as a woman's book. So I've suddenly come over all Tom Baker in Blackadder. I wager that's a woman's book. This book, sorry. I love Barbara Pym now. This is the fourth Barbara Pym novel I've read. I like them all. She writes with such precision and wit. Her books can seem deceptively light, with their cast of sort of middle-class, church-going, academic-adjacent women and emotionally inept men. They're sort of novels of hidden depth, but most importantly, they're beautifully written. Um, so I read that and enjoyed it. I recommend. I'm going to say part of the reason I read Barbara Pym was there's a very good book podcast called Backlisted, and I think quite early on in Backlisted they did Barbara Pym, and it made me want to read one of her books, which I did, and I loved it so much that I am planning to read them all. And again, the value of opening your mind to things you wouldn't necessarily open your mind to normally. I love Barbara Pym. Can't recommend her enough. If you're looking for a good novel, read Barbara Pym. Now, what then happened was I thought, well, as I'm on a Barbara Pym run, I will read Barbara Pym's A Very Private Eye, an autobiography in diaries and letters. Now, this was written after Barbara Pym died. I think it's with her literary editor, who I will talk about again in a minute, Hilary Hazel Holt, and Barbara Pym's sister Hazel Pym. It's, as it says, it's a collection of entries from her diaries, from her notebooks, and letters. Mostly the letters are to people who aren't very famous. Although towards the end there's a lot of letters to Philip Larkin. I really enjoyed reading this because it's a really insight into who Barbara Pym was as a person, to the relationship she had that influenced what she wrote. And actually, you realise once you read this how much of her novels are almost not quite autofiction. There's more between them and that, but there's an element of that in all her books. I think there are omissions from this. Some were done by Barbara Pym herself, who tore pages out of her notebooks and diaries. Some by natural loss of letters and things, and some by the choices of the editors. But even with this, it's a real insight into Pym as a person. And again, like Romney's book, it provides a list of potential reading for you. Writers that she was reading, writers that she really admired, people like Ivy Compton Burnett, or Burnett. Aldous Huxley, she really raves about Aldous Huxley, who's, I think I've only read one of his books, which is I can't remember the title of it because my brain isn't working, which is his most famous book. But she raves about him, but there's lots of other people. It's the war stuff from the war is very interesting. I found the most interesting section was between I'm talking about people disappearing. There was a possibility that Barbara Pym could have disappeared as a writer, because from the late 60s until 1977 she went out of fashion, and her publisher Jonathan Cape, who I judge harshly, stopped publishing her books, and nobody else would publish her books because they were seen to be out of step with the times, which they probably were, but that didn't stop them being good books. And it wasn't until 1977 when I think it was the Times Literary Supplement, did a perhaps because of the Jubilee year, did a underrated, underappreciated writers of the 20th century column, and both Pym was mentioned by both Lord David Cecil and by Philip Larkin, and that double whammy. And I think also Philip Larkin wrote an article called something like "The Welcome to the World of Miss Pym" or something along those lines, and that got her back in public attention. They started publishing her books again, and they published them up until her death in 1981, something like that. Actually, she died roughly about the same time as the next author that I'm going to talk about, and it's great for that. And you can feel her frustration and the impact it has on her self confidence. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. Again, this one I would say is a book for people who really like Barbara Pym. It's not something I'd say just pick up and read, or you have an interest in writers and how writers are formed. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. And then on a completely different direction, I read Philip K. Dick's The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. This is Philip K. Dick's last novel. It was published. I think it actually came out after he died, but it came out in 1982. It's not sci-fi Philip K. Dick. It's more. I'm going to call it philosophical Philip K. Dick. It's told by Angel Archer, who is the daughter-in-law of Bishop Timothy Archer, who is the Bishop of California, who is undergoing what can be best described as a crisis, as an existential crisis. During the process of this book, Timothy Archer's son commits suicide. His mistress dies, and Archer himself dies. And the story is from Angel's POV all the way through. There's the only other main character in it is Bill Luchtenberg. I've got to get that name wrong. Who is the son of Timothy Archer's mistress, who is suffering from he's schizophrenic as far as everybody can tell. And actually, when I talk about the next book. I think what happens to him is very much what happened to Philip K. Dick himself. I really enjoyed it. This is a book that comes with a bibliography. This is not just not a science fiction like a novel. This has extracts from, as it says here, Aeschylus, Aristophanes. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Aristophanes, the Bible, Buchner, Dante, John Donne, Goethe, Aldous Huxley again mentioned. So I think this. I really enjoyed this though. I could see some people might find it a bit of a pretentious slog, but it's really well written, and it is almost a man struggling to understand the nature of the world. Apparently, it's part of a trilogy, a very loose trilogy. But I really liked this. I don't know if I would recommend it as a place to start with Philip K. Dick. I have read a number of Philip K. Dick novels, not as many as I thought actually when I checked the number of novels, but he did write a lot. But I think this has got me on a Philip K. Dick kick to the extent that I then read, because I saw it on. I did a search on Libby to see how many Philip K. Dick books they had, which is not a lot considering how many books he's actually published. But there was on there a book called The Last Interview and Other Conversations, which is a series of Philip K. Dick interviews edited by, is it David Stretfield? Somebody Stretfield anyway. It's a number of interviews over a course of about 10-15 years, including the final interview he did literally a couple of days before he died, that is very instructive into how Philip K. Dick thought, what influenced him, what motivated him. There's some really good stuff in the later sections on the coming together of Blade Runner as a movie, and his feelings about the initial scripts, and then how it developed, and how he seemed to be quite satisfied with the final version of the film because it had followed through the two main themes that he wanted to pass on. It's really good. Because actually, the last bit Philip K. Dick was probably mentally ill. And I wish I had a copy of. I read a long time ago Lawrence Sutin's book Divine Invasions, which is a biography of Philip K. Dick that I really recommend. But I wish I'd had that with me because it explains in a bit more detail about what issues he was suffering from. But I really found it quite. The last section is quite when he's talking about what he thinks happened to him. Which, as I said, ties in with some of what happens in the transmigration of Timothy Archer. But also, again, it's a sort of philosophy. He talks about the philosophy he read, and he dropped out of university in the late 40s, but he kind of self-educated. And there's lots of, again, possible people to read, including a number of science fiction authors. Again, apparently this is part of a series. There's a last interview thing for a lot of authors, and I kind of think it should be. It's probably worth me dipping into some more of them. But that's where I got to. My current books on the go are on the subject of Barbara Pym. This is Hazel Holt's A Lot to Ask, A Life of Barbara Pym. This actually, and oh, knocked my tea bags over. This and this are effectively like one book, because some of what is missing from this is in this, and some things that aren't in this are in this. It's fun. It's quite an interesting read so far. There's a lot from Pym herself. I don't know if it's less of a biography. It reminded me a bit of the Lucian Freud biography that I read that has a lot of Lucian Freud in it. It's like almost like I called it like a DVD commentary. It's like somebody's written a biography and the writer themselves is doing a DVD commentary. This isn't quite that, but there's a lot of Barbara Pym in this. And I'm not sure it kind of entirely works as a biography, but it's interesting so far. There is another more recent biography, which is called something like The Adventures of Miss Pym, that I'd really like to read, and I'll hopefully get to that at some point. I've also, still working my way through this. As you can see, there's a lot of notes. My plan is this has got to go back to the library on the 24th of April, so I'm going to plod through this. This is great so far. Really good on the whole issue of British slavery and then the fight to stop slavery. I have two long-term books that I'm reading for specific, for sort of big sort of read projects. There's Lists, which is The Lives of the Poets, by Michael Schmidt, which I've mentioned before. This is a sort of history of English language poetry from Langland, Chaucer, up to what was then the present day-ish, which is when this book was published, which was 1997, I think. 1998. And that ties in with Harold Bloom's The Western Canon. I'm working my way very slowly through this. I have some issues with this book, partly because Harold Bloom comes across as such an arrogant twat, for want of a better phrase, and I find myself questioning some of his opinions on the authors that I have read. So God knows how accurate or how I would feel about the other ones if I actually knew much about them. It's an interesting read. I'm kind of reading it for the purpose of. I've come to the conclusion the best thing you can do is create your own canon, and this is part of that. This isn't the only thing, and this is part of it. These I'm not going to finish in the short period. This is probably going to be a year long. Both of these are going to be a year long reading project. I might finish them before that if I get into a fit of needing to. But these are ongoing. God, ow! And now I've got to choose the next book to read novel wise. I'm not sure what that will be. But I will update you next week. This has got to almost half an hour, but that's because I haven't updated people for a long time. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please like this or subscribe. If you didn't, don't tell me, please. I don't want to know. And have a good day. Thanks very much. Bye bye.